Evening had already settled over Round Rock, Texas, the kind of quiet suburban calm that used to comfort Betty Collins. At 68, she'd learned to appreciate silence, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking wall clock, the gentle creak of the wooden floor whenever she shifted her weight. The house was still, its warmth dimmed by the faint scent of reheated stew. She moved slowly around the kitchen, setting a single plate on the counter, humming without realizing it, like she always did when she was alone. Her phone buzzed, a small vibration on the table. Nothing urgent, she thought. Probably one of those neighborhood alerts or a message from the pharmacy. She reached for it with a faint smile that vanished the second her eyes read the screen. Don't forget to heat up the leftovers in the fridge. No need to waste food. The message sat there, blunt and cold, signed with her daughter-in-law's name, Valerie. Betty read it once, then again, as though repetition might soften it, make it sound less like an order. But it didn't. Each word struck her with quiet precision. Don't forget. Leftovers. No need to waste. The tone was polite on the surface, but she could hear the condescension beneath, that subtle implication that she couldn't even manage dinner for herself. Her hand trembled slightly. She placed the phone face down on the table. The kitchen light flickered once, and the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence again. For a moment, she stood there, frozen, looking at the tidy counter she had scrubbed that morning, the spotless floor, the framed photo of her late husband, Thomas, smiling beside the pecan tree they'd planted the year Richard was born. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and memories. Betty wasn't a woman who cried easily. Years of raising a son, losing a husband, and learning to stretch every dollar had taught her to swallow pain quietly. But tonight, something inside her shifted, not the hot sting of anger, but the slow ache of being unseen. She thought of Valerie's voice, bright, professional, always slightly impatient. Of Richard's distracted smile whenever his wife spoke for him. Of how she'd given up her own home in Fredericksburg to help them start fresh. And now, 3 years later, she was being told to heat up leftovers like an afterthought. She sat down at the small table and let her fingers trace the wood grain. The phone buzzed again, a second notification, another message from Valerie. She didn't even look at it this time. Instead, she turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the warm glow from the hallway lamp. Outside, the wind rustled through the oak trees lining the yard. Betty watched their shadows sway against the wall. Calm and patient, her breathing slowed. The initial sting faded, replaced by something steadier, an almost eerie clarity. She realized she wasn't angry at the message itself. She was angry at what it represented. Years of quiet sacrifices that no one seemed to remember. Years of being reduced to convenience. Betty stood up, folded the dish towel neatly, and placed it beside the sink. She looked around the kitchen, her son's home, but somehow no longer hers, and whispered to the empty air, "All right then." Her voice was calm, controlled, the kind of tone that didn't announce a storm, but promised one was coming. And as she turned off the final light and the house sank into darkness, that single text kept echoing in her mind, not as an insult, but as a beginning. 3 years earlier, the house in Fredericksburg still smelled faintly of cedar and the coffee Thomas used to brew at dawn. After his passing, the rooms felt too big for one person. Betty kept the curtains drawn halfway, as though afraid too much sunlight would expose the emptiness she wasn't ready to face. The pecan tree in the yard had grown tall, its roots strong and unmoving, unlike her life, which suddenly felt fragile, suspended. Richard came down from Austin every other weekend that first year, full of good intentions and gentle concern. "Mom," he said one afternoon, running a hand through his hair, "you can't keep living out here by yourself. It's too far from everything, doctors, grocery stores, us." Valerie had stood beside him, elegant in her pressed slacks and pearl earrings, nodding with practiced sympathy. "We've been thinking," she said, "maybe we could find a house together. One with a guest suite for you, close to the kids' school and the hospital. You'd never have to worry about anything again." It sounded so reasonable, so kind. Betty hesitated, glancing through the window at the yard Thomas had tended for decades. "This house is paid off," she murmured. "Your father built most of it himself. I don't want to lose that." Richard reached for her hand. "You're not losing it, Mom. You're gaining family." And that was what broke her resolve. She'd always wanted to be near them, to watch her grandkids grow up, to feel useful again. Within a month, she'd agreed to sell. The sale closed faster than she expected. The buyer, a young couple from Houston, paid in full, and the proceeds from the old farmhouse set neatly in her checking account. $35,000. Her life savings, every penny she and Thomas had ever scraped together after bills and taxes. When Valerie offered to handle the paperwork for the new home, Betty was relieved. Valerie worked in corporate management. She knew about contracts and deadlines. "I'll make sure everything's done properly," she said with that reassuring smile. "All you'll have to do is move in." Betty transferred the money for the down payment the next day. She even insisted on paying extra for the closing costs, wanting to feel that the house was truly theirs. When the mortgage officer handed over a folder full of documents, she didn't notice her name missing from the deed. She was too busy imagining the guest room she'd decorate, the lace curtains, the rocking chair by the window, the quilts folded at the end of the bed. The move to Round Rock felt like the start of something good. The new house was modern, with a big kitchen and a yard large enough for the grandchildren to chase fireflies at night. Richard seemed happy. Valerie was energetic and efficient, and for a while Betty believed she'd found a new kind of peace. She unpacked boxes labeled Mom's Things and placed her husband's tools neatly in the garage corner. On the first Sunday, she baked an apple pie just like Thomas used to love. Valerie thanked her with a quick smile and a distracted nod before rushing off to a work call. Richard kissed her on the cheek, said, "Thanks, Mom," and went to help the kids with their homework. For months, Betty ignored the small things. The way Valerie referred to the house as our home, never ours. The way mail addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Richard Collins kept filling the mailbox, while anything with her name had to be forwarded from Fredericksburg. It wasn't until she overheard a conversation between Valerie and a neighbor that a faint unease began to settle. The woman asked if the house was a family property, and Valerie had laughed lightly. "Oh, no," she said. "Richard and I bought it ourselves. His mom just stays with us. She's sweet, helps with the kids. Just stays with us." The word stung, but Betty forced herself to smile when Valerie returned inside. She didn't confront her. She didn't even tell Richard. Instead, she went to her room, opened the box that held her husband's will, and ran her fingers across the old envelope. Thomas had once told her, "Keep records, Bea. One day you'll need them more than you think." That night, she placed every document, bank slips, sale receipts, copies of the deed, into a folder marked with her own handwriting. Fredericksburg property sold. She didn't know why she did it then, only that it felt right. Pride and love had led her here, into a home that wasn't hers. And somewhere deep down, beneath the gentleness of her heart, a quiet instinct was already preparing for the day she'd need to remember exactly how much she'd given. And to whom? The house in Round Rock was large enough to echo, but somehow it always felt smaller when Valerie was home. Her presence filled every room, her voice brisk, her perfume sharp, her footsteps quick and decisive. Betty moved quietly around her, like a shadow in her own life, learning to predict Valerie's moods the way farmers read weather patterns, always scanning for the next storm. Most mornings began the same way. Betty rose early, before the sun crested over the cul-de-sac, to prepare breakfast. Pancakes for the kids, oatmeal for Richard, and egg whites for Valerie. She brewed coffee, packed lunches, and folded laundry in the lull between the chaos. By the time Valerie came down the stairs, crisp in a navy blazer, the kitchen would already smell like cinnamon and toast. "Thanks, Betty," Valerie would say, glancing at her phone. "Just maybe less syrup next time. The kids don't need all that sugar." Betty would nod, smile faintly, and return to the sink. She didn't mind helping. She'd raised Richard the same way. Except back then, gratitude had come with warmth, not critique. The days blurred into one another. Valerie's schedule was relentless. Business trips, client dinners, Zoom calls that stretched past midnight. Richard, sweet but distracted, spent his evenings reviewing financial reports or helping the kids with homework. Betty filled the spaces in between. She swept floors, changed sheets, and listened to the house breathe. Once, she caught Valerie refolding the towels she'd just stacked in the linen closet. "It's just easier if they're done this way," Valerie said lightly. "No offense." "Of course," Betty murmured, forcing a smile. She retreated to the laundry room and stayed there longer than she needed to, pretending to wait for the dryer to finish. Dinner time was the hardest. Valerie often arrived home late, tense from traffic, carrying the stress of the day like armor. Betty served meals quietly, making sure everyone's plate was warm. Yet no matter how carefully she cooked, something was always off. "The chicken's a little dry tonight," Valerie said once, pushing her plate away after 2 bites. Another evening it was, "You don't have to make mashed potatoes so often. They're heavy." Richard barely noticed. "Mom, could you pass the salt?" he'd ask absently, eyes still on his phone. Betty would hand it over and glance at the dining table, the seat at the far corner, hers always empty. She ate later, after they'd finished, when the dishes were stacked and the house had gone quiet. Sitting at that lonely spot, she would trace circles on the wood grain and listen to the distant hum of the dishwasher. That empty chair became a symbol she couldn't ignore, a quiet, invisible reminder of her place in the house. Not a guest, not family, just someone who existed between meals, between their conversations, between the life she once thought she'd share. Sometimes she'd call Clara, her old friend from Fredericksburg. "They're good kids," Betty would say softly, trying to sound convincing. "Valerie just likes things a certain way." Clara's voice on the other end was gentle but firm. "Betty, you don't have to earn your place with them. You already did years ago." But Betty wasn't sure she believed that anymore. At night, when the rest of the house slept, she'd walk down the hall to peek into her grandchildren's rooms. Their soft breathing reminded her why she stayed. She'd pull the blankets up to their chins, whisper goodnight, and close the door as quietly as she could. Then she'd return to her own room, where a single photograph of Thomas sat on the dresser. His smile seemed smaller now, as though even memory had grown tired. She lay down and stared at the ceiling, the sound of distant laughter echoing faintly from downstairs. It was always Valerie's laugh, confident, certain belonging. Betty turned to her side, eyes open in the dark. The loneliness no longer stung. It had hardened into something else. Not anger, not yet. Just a still, heavy calm. The kind that comes before ice begins to crack. It happened on a Friday evening, the kind of golden Texas dusk that made the whole neighborhood glow. The smell of barbecue and cut grass drifted in through the open kitchen window. Betty had just finished setting the table for herself. A simple meal. Chicken soup and half a cornbread loaf she'd baked that morning. She didn't expect company. She rarely did anymore. The house was unusually quiet. From upstairs came the muffled sound of Valerie's heels against the hardwood floor, then the clatter of hangers in the closet. Betty heard voices, excited, hurried. Valerie's, bright and triumphant. Richard's, trying to keep up. They hadn't told her much, only that Valerie had an important announcement at work and they might be out for a while. Minutes later, the front door closed, the garage door rumbled, and the silence returned. Betty walked to the window just in time to see Valerie's car pull out of the driveway. Richard in the passenger seat, the kids in the back seat, dressed nicer than usual. Valerie's laughter, confident and sharp, carried faintly through the air before the sound faded down the street. She stood there for a while, one hand resting on the curtain. The house behind her smelled like lemon cleaner and roast chicken cooling on the counter. She thought briefly that they'd forgotten to tell her where they were going. Then again, maybe they hadn't forgotten at all. Later that night, she found out exactly where they were. Betty sat at the small kitchen table, the television on mute, scrolling through her phone out of habit. On her social media feed, a photo appeared, posted by Valerie. A group of people around a long restaurant table, all smiles and wine glasses. Valerie in the center, radiant in red. The caption read, "Promotion night. Couldn't have done it without my amazing team and my family." Her family. Betty's heart clenched, not from surprise, but from recognition. The kind that doesn't sting immediately, it burns slow, like something settling deep into bone. She studied the picture, her son laughing, his hand on Valerie's shoulder, the children grinning beside a chocolate cake with sparklers. It was a full table, a celebration, and there was no empty chair for her. Her phone buzzed. A text from Valerie. "There's some lasagna in the fridge if you're hungry. Heat up the leftovers." Betty's thumb hovered over the screen. She didn't reply. She didn't throw the phone or cry or whisper her usual, "It's all right. They're just busy." Instead, she set it down on the table beside her untouched bowl of soup and stared at the glow of the refrigerator light spilling across the floor. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, and the hum of the highway rolled faintly through the night air. Betty took a deep breath and closed the refrigerator door. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a stage she was stepping off of. The silence was different now, not heavy, but clean. She sat back in her chair, folded her hands, and let the calm spread through her chest. No tears, no trembling. Just an understanding that something in her had finally finished breaking. And in that quiet, something new was beginning to form. She glanced once more at Valerie's smiling face on the phone screen, then pressed the button to turn it black. The refrigerator hummed on, steady and indifferent. Betty's reflection in the dark window stared back at her, still, composed, eyes unwavering. The night went on, but she didn't feel left behind anymore. She felt ready. The house was silent long after midnight. Betty sat in her small bedroom, the lamplight spilling across the quilt she'd stitched years ago. Her hands were restless. The calm she'd found earlier that evening had sharpened into something else, a need for clarity, for proof. She opened the old cedar drawer of her dresser, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender sachets. Beneath folded scarves and a half-finished embroidery kit, her fingers brushed against something firm, a small wooden sewing box. She lifted it out carefully and set it on the bed. Inside, beneath spools of faded thread, lay a yellowed envelope she hadn't seen in years. The label read in her own handwriting, "Fredericksburg property sold." Her pulse quickened. She emptied the contents onto the bed, papers neatly folded, receipts stacked in order. There it was, the deed of trust, her name printed clearly beside Thomas's. Below it, the bill of sale from when she sold the farmhouse, stamped and notarized. And at the bottom, a printed wire transfer receipt for the $35,000 she'd moved from her account to Richard and Valerie's lender. Every transaction she had made to build their new life was there, catalogued like breadcrumbs she hadn't realized she'd been leaving behind. She sat for a moment, the weight of it all pressing on her chest. Valerie had told her she was too old to deal with contracts, had insisted that the bank prefers one name on the title. But here it was, every document proving otherwise. Betty flipped through the pages, then reached for another folder, one she kept in the nightstand. her little spiral notebook. Inside, in neat handwriting, she had recorded every expense she'd covered since moving in. Groceries, electric bills, school uniforms, medication, even the new washing machine Valerie had wanted last summer. Each entry had a date, an amount, and a short note in parentheses. Richard was short on his bonus. Valerie's card declined. She had done it out of habit, not suspicion. But now the ledger read like evidence. Her fingers trembled slightly as she realized how much she'd given, how quietly she'd financed their comfort without ever being acknowledged. She looked at the clock. 1:07 a.m. Betty stood, grabbed her reading glasses, and reached for her phone. She scrolled through the contacts until she found a familiar name. Marian Foster, her niece, the only lawyer in the family. For a moment she hesitated. Marianne was always busy, a mother of two, working late hours in Austin. But then Betty thought of that text from Valerie, heat up the leftovers and press call. The phone rang twice before a sleepy voice answered. Aunt Betty? Is everything okay? I'm sorry to call so late, honey, Betty said, her voice calm but steady. I need to ask you something about property law. Marianne woke up instantly. What happened? Betty explained, softly, carefully, how she'd sold her house, paid the down payment for her sons, and trusted her daughter-in-law to handle the paperwork. She described the folder in her hands, the receipts, the deed, the transfers. There was a long pause on the other end. Aunt Betty, Marianne said finally, if those documents are what you say they are, then the property isn't entirely theirs. You still have legal interest. You could reclaim it. Betty didn't speak for a few seconds. I see, she said quietly. Thank you, sweetheart. That's all I needed to know tonight. After she hung up, she called one more person, Clara Ruiz, her best friend in South Austin. Clara answered right away. Betty's name lighting up past midnight was reason enough. Betty, you all right? I think I will be, Betty said, a faint strength returning to her tone. I just needed to make sure of something. When she ended the call, she gathered the papers and placed them neatly into a clean folder. This time, she wrote a new label on the front with a steady hand, Round Rock Collins Residence. Then she slid it into her handbag, zipped it closed, and sat back on the bed. The quiet no longer felt heavy. It felt purposeful. For months she'd lived as a shadow, her worth questioned and her presence diminished. But now, surrounded by the rustle of documents and the steady rhythm of her own breathing, she felt the faint stirrings of control. She turned off the lamp, the house falling into darkness. Tomorrow, she decided, would not be another day of waiting. Tonight, for the first time in years, Betty Collins slept with a plan. The next night arrived wrapped in the kind of stillness that precedes change. From the window, Betty watched the driveway lights blink on, then fade as the family car backed out and disappeared down the street. Laughter echoed faintly, a sound she'd once cherished, now hollow and distant. Valerie had planned another dinner, another celebration that didn't include her. It was perfect. She waited 5 minutes after the last sound faded before moving. Her steps were deliberate, slow, but there was no hesitation. In her bedroom, the suitcase lay open on the bed. It wasn't large, just enough for the essentials. 2 sets of clothes, her mother's brooch, her reading glasses, the folder of documents, and the spiral notebook. Everything else she left where it was. The house smelled faintly of vanilla candles and detergent. It was spotless the way Valerie liked it. Betty ran her hand along the edge of the dresser, feeling the smooth polish beneath her fingers, and smiled faintly. Every inch of the place had known her care, her hands, and yet she had never belonged here. On the dining table downstairs, she placed a single folded sheet of paper, her handwriting neat, the words steady. Don't worry about the leftovers. You'll have plenty once I'm gone. No anger, no accusation. Just a statement, calm and final. She set her house keys beside it, then looked around one last time. The silence was different tonight, no longer oppressive, but clean, almost sacred. Betty took a breath and turned off the kitchen light. The faint reflection in the window showed a woman who looked older, yes, but not defeated. Her eyes caught the glow of the porch light, and for the first time in years, she saw something unmistakable behind them. Resolve. Outside, the night air was warm, thick with the scent of crepe myrtle and asphalt cooling after the day's heat. Street lights stretched in even rows along the quiet subdivision. Their golden pools of light reflected in her eyes as she stepped onto the curb. A taxi she'd called 20 minutes earlier rolled up, headlights soft and low. Evening. Ma'am, the driver said as he opened the trunk. Heading to Austin? She nodded. South Austin, near Barton Springs. He smiled, lifting her suitcase. Beautiful area. Betty slid into the back seat. The car hummed to life, easing out of the neighborhood. As they passed the familiar houses, the manicured lawns, the mailboxes painted in cheerful colors, she felt the invisible thread that tied her there begin to loosen. Each block they passed was another layer of weight slipping away. The city lights grew brighter the closer they drew to Austin. She turned her face toward the window, watching the highway blur into streaks of gold and white. Her reflection overlapped the passing lights, two images of the same woman, one fading, one emerging. In her lap, she kept one hand on the folder of documents. It was more than paper now. It was proof of her memory, her worth, her quiet endurance. The other hand rested over her heart, steady, grounded. The driver glanced at her through the mirror. You all right back there? Betty's eyes didn't leave the window. I'm fine, she said softly. Just thinking about home. He nodded and said nothing more. By the time the taxi pulled up in front of Clara's modest brick house, the moon had risen high, pale and watchful over the Texas night. Clara opened the door before Betty could knock, concern etched across her face, but Betty only smiled, calm and tired. I just needed a change of scenery, she said. As Clara ushered her in, the porch light flickered behind them, casting one last shimmer on the quiet street. The same glow that had once reflected off Betty's tears now glinted off her steady gaze. Tonight she hadn't run away. She had simply walked toward herself. Morning broke over Round Rock with a washed-out light, the kind that made everything look too honest. The Collins family car rolled into the driveway just after 9, laughter still spilling from the front seats, remnants of the previous night's celebration. Valerie was radiant in sunglasses and a new silk blouse, still buzzing from the praise she'd received at dinner. Richard yawned, one hand wrapped around a to-go coffee. The kids dozed in the back, clutching leftover balloons from the restaurant. When they stepped inside, the air felt different, stale, hollow. Valerie frowned almost immediately. Why are the lights off? She murmured, kicking off her heels. Betty usually opens all the blinds by now. Richard shrugged, setting his coffee on the counter. Maybe she went for a walk. But the kitchen was spotless, too spotless. No breakfast laid out, no kettle on the stove. No faint sound of a radio humming in the background. The usual rhythm of their mornings, Betty's soft movements. The smell of toast was gone. Valerie's eyes landed on the dining table. A single piece of folded paper rested in the center, placed perfectly square. Beside it, a set of keys. She walked closer, her pulse quickening before she even picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable, graceful, careful and calm. Don't worry about the leftovers. You'll have plenty once I'm gone. Richard stepped behind her, reading over her shoulder. What is this supposed to mean? His voice cracked slightly, unsure whether to be angry or afraid. Valerie didn't answer. Her gaze drifted to the folder lying beside the note. She opened it slowly, and her fingers went still as her eyes scanned the pages inside. Deed of trust property owner, Betty Collins. Wire transfer amount, $35,000. Mortgage deposit from account, Elizabeth Collins. Her mouth went dry. "Oh my God," she whispered. Richard leaned in, confusion etched across his face. "What is that?" "These are property documents." Her voice faltered. "The house, Richard, the deed still has her name on it. She never gave it up." He blinked, uncomprehending. "That can't be right. We've been paying the mortgage with her money," Valerie snapped before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air like gunfire. He looked at her sharply. "What are you talking about?" Valerie turned away, clutching the papers. She helped with the down payment. "I didn't think it mattered." Richard's expression hardened, his disbelief twisting into guilt. "You didn't think it mattered?" Before she could answer, a small voice broke the tension. Their son stood at the bottom of the stairs, clutching his stuffed bear. "Where's Grandma?" he asked, sleepy and confused. Neither of them spoke. The boy frowned, looking from one parent to the other. "Did she go home?" Valerie swallowed, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. She went to visit a friend." But the lie came out thin and brittle. Richard sat down at the table, staring at the note again. His mother's handwriting looked so composed, almost peaceful. He thought of her last week, quietly folding laundry while Valerie scrolled through her phone, of the countless meals, the errands, the invisible care. And now, gone, leaving nothing but the truth in black and white. The silence in the house grew heavy. Valerie set the folder down and gripped the back of a chair, her face pale. "Richard," she said softly, "if she takes this to a lawyer," he cut her off, his voice low. "She already has." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees along the fence line. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, hitting the table where Betty's note and documents lay side by side. The golden light made the ink shimmer faintly, as if alive. For the first time in years, Valerie felt something she hadn't expected to feel in her own home: fear. And Richard, sitting there in the same silence his mother had endured for so long, realized that the quiet could be louder than any storm. Clara's house in South Austin was small but full of warmth, the kind that came from lived-in comfort rather than design. The air smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon, and the morning light filtered softly through gauzy curtains. Betty sat by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. For the first time in years, she woke without the weight of obligation pressing on her chest. Clara moved around the kitchen, humming. "You're sure you're all right here?" she asked for the third time. Betty smiled. "You've asked me that every hour since I got here." "Well, forgive me," Clara said, setting a plate of toast on the table. "It's not every day you show up at my door with a suitcase and a folder thick enough to bring down an empire." Betty chuckled softly, though the sound carried a trace of sadness. "I'm fine. Really. I just needed distance. A little space to think." After breakfast, she sat down with her notebook, the same one she'd filled with numbers, receipts, and half-finished grocery lists, and began a new page. But instead of figures, she wrote words. 3 years ago, I gave up my home to live with my son and his wife. I thought I was joining a family. Instead, I became a guest in my own life. This week, I decided to reclaim it." She paused, the pen hovering above the paper. Then, slowly, she continued. The words came easily, honest and unpolished. She wrote about gratitude turned into guilt, about how silence can feel like kindness until it becomes a cage. She ended with a line that even surprised her. "Love shouldn't make you smaller. It should make you more yourself." That night, Clara found her at the kitchen table, typing the same words into her old laptop. "You're posting this?" Clara asked. "I think so," Betty said. "Maybe someone else needs to hear it." The post went up on Facebook just after midnight. No hashtags, no dramatics, just her story, told plainly. By morning, it had spread like wildfire. Dozens of comments, then hundreds. Messages poured in from women across Texas and beyond. Widows, single mothers, daughters who had been made to feel like burdens in their own homes. They thanked her for her courage, for saying what they hadn't dared to put into words. One comment stood out. "You didn't lose your home, Mrs. Collins. You built one in all of us who've been there." Betty read it twice and felt her throat tighten, not from pain, but from something like peace. Meanwhile, in Round Rock, the ripple was just beginning to reach its shore. Valerie arrived at work that Monday to find whispers trailing behind her. A co-worker showed her the post. "Isn't this about your mother-in-law?" someone asked. The color drained from Valerie's face as she scrolled through the thread. Her own neighbors had commented, some even mentioning the house. At home, Richard sat at the kitchen table, staring at the same post on his phone. The words felt like a mirror he hadn't wanted to look into. Every sentence echoed his mother's quiet endurance, her unspoken kindness. He realized, with a sick twist in his stomach, that he hadn't just lost her trust, he'd lost the right to her silence. He remembered the nights she'd waited up for him, the way she never complained when Valerie dismissed her, the meals she made without being asked. She had carried the weight of their comfort on her back, and he had mistaken it for duty. In that moment, guilt gave way to grief. Back in Austin, Betty scrolled through the hundreds of messages lighting up her screen. Her post had become a conversation, a movement of sorts. She closed her laptop and looked out the window, the setting sun spilling gold across the sky. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt steady, free. Her revenge wasn't loud, and it wasn't cruel. It was the truth, spoken clearly, finally in her own voice. Justice, she realized, didn't always come from courtrooms or contracts. Sometimes it came from being heard. A week later, the air in Austin was cool and gray, the kind of morning that carried both stillness and weight. Betty sat on Clara's porch, her journal open on her lap, the sound of sparrows soft against the steady hum of passing cars. She didn't expect visitors, but when she saw the familiar sedan pull up in front of the house, her breath caught just slightly. Richard stepped out, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. He hesitated at the walkway, holding his keys like he wasn't sure what to do with his hands. Clara, watering her potted plants nearby, caught Betty's glance. "You want me to send him away?" she asked quietly. Betty shook her head. "No, let him come." Richard climbed the porch steps, his voice uncertain. "Mom." It had been years since he'd said that word with such care. Betty motioned for him to sit. He did, though he looked like he didn't know how to begin. "I saw your post," he said, finally, his tone low. "It's everywhere. People at work. Even the pastor, everyone's talking about it." Betty closed her notebook and set it aside. "I didn't write it for them," she said. "I wrote it for me." He nodded, eyes downcast. "I know, and you were right." He paused, his throat tightening. "I didn't see what you were going through. I let Valerie," Betty interrupted softly. "You let her speak for both of you." He looked up, startled by her calmness. There was no anger in her eyes, only something heavier. Disappointment, quiet and deep. "I came to make things right," he said. "I'll sign whatever papers you want. If you want the house back or money," she raised a hand. "This isn't about money, Richard. It never was." From beside her chair, she pulled out a familiar spiral notebook, edges worn and corners bent. "You remember this?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Your expense journal." "I kept it because I needed to remind myself what I'd done," she said, flipping through the pages. "Groceries, utilities, down payment, even the clothes on your children's backs. I gave because I wanted to. But love without respect isn't generosity, it's servitude." Richard swallowed hard, his jaw trembling. I didn't know it was that much. Valerie always said. Betty handed him a small USB drive from the table. You might want to listen to this before finishing that sentence. He frowned, taking it. What is it? A recording, she said simply. From the night you both came home from your anniversary dinner last spring. You'd gone to put the kids to bed. She didn't realize her phone was still connected to the Bluetooth speaker in the living room. Richard's face went pale. Betty's gaze didn't waver. She told her friend, "She's not family, she's a burden." For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of wind brushing through the magnolia tree filled the silence. Richard's lips parted, but no words came. He stared at the drive in his hand as though it burned. She didn't mean, he began weakly, but stopped. Because maybe she had. Betty leaned back, folding her hands. I'm not giving it to you out of spite. I'm giving it to you because you deserve the truth, just like I did. He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just avoiding the truth. Betty's voice softened. You were protecting your comfort. And comfort is a dangerous thing. It makes people forget who fed them when they were hungry. He bowed his head, tears slipping down his cheeks. Can you ever forgive me? She looked out at the quiet street before answering. Forgiveness isn't a gift, Richard. It's a choice. One I'll make when you start remembering who you came from. He nodded, unable to speak. When he left, the air seemed lighter somehow, not because the pain had vanished, but because it had finally been spoken. Betty sat there for a while longer, the USB drive gone from her table, the empty teacup beside her cooling in the morning breeze. She didn't feel victorious. She felt at peace. For years, silence had been her prison. Today, it had become her verdict. Downtown Austin shimmered under late afternoon sunlight, the glass of the law firm's office tower reflecting the sky in fractured blues and golds. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed but taut, like air before a storm. Betty sat at the long walnut conference table, her posture straight, her expression composed. Across from her sat Richard, pale and restless, and beside him Valerie, whose once confident demeanor had shrunk into something uncertain. At the head of the table was Marian Foster, Betty's niece, the young attorney whose quiet authority filled the room more than any raised voice could. Marianne adjusted her glasses and tapped the document before her. We've reviewed the property transfer, the mortgage records, and Mrs. Collins's documented contributions. Legally, she remains a co-owner of the residence in Round Rock, but she's offered an alternative arrangement. Valerie's hands tightened around her pen. What kind of arrangement? Marian looked to Betty, giving her the floor. Betty's tone was calm, almost gentle. 60-40. The house stays under both your names, but my share is restored on paper. You'll keep living there. I don't need the money, Valerie. I just want the truth reflected where it belongs. For a moment, only the hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. Richard looked from his mother to his wife, guilt etched deep across his face. Valerie's jaw tensed. You're right, she said finally, her voice breaking slightly. You're right, Mrs. Collins. Elite. I told myself I was protecting our family, but really, I just didn't want to share control. She exhaled shakily, the admission landing like a confession in church. I was cruel to you, and I knew it. You were the one person who never asked for anything, and I treated you like a maid. Betty watched her carefully. You were afraid, she said softly. Afraid that kindness would make you small. But it's the opposite, Valerie. Kindness is the only thing that ever makes us bigger. Richard's eyes shimmered. Mom, he began, his voice cracking. I don't know how to fix what I've done. You already started, Betty said. You came. Marianne slid the ownership documents across the table, followed by a pen. Valerie's hand trembled as she signed the new deed. 60% Betty Collins, 40% Richard and Valerie Collins. Richard followed, his signature uneven but steady. When Marianne added her notary seal, the sound of the metal press echoed softly, final and irrevocable. Then came the second document, an agreement for family counseling sessions, recommended by Marianne's colleague, a therapist who specialized in generational reconciliation. Valerie hesitated for a moment before signing again. When the papers were done, Betty leaned back, her gaze serene. "You can keep the house," she said. "All of it." Valerie blinked, confused. "But you, what do you mean?" "I don't want the money," Betty said simply. "Or the property. Freedom's worth more than any of it." Richard's lips parted in disbelief. "Then why?" "Because it's not about punishment," she interrupted. "It's about balance. The truth was out of place, and now it isn't." For the first time since the meeting began, a faint smile touched her face. Not triumphant, not bitter, but peaceful. Outside the window, the traffic lights blinked red and gold against the setting sun, casting long reflections across the polished table. Betty gathered her purse, stood slowly, and looked at her son and daughter-in-law, two people who had once mistaken her silence for weakness. "Sometimes disappearing isn't running away," she said quietly. "It's showing them how empty the world becomes when the woman who held it together finally lets go." Valerie lowered her eyes, tears sliding down her cheek. Richard looked away, ashamed but somehow relieved, as though the truth had stripped something heavy from them both. Betty turned toward the door, her steps soft but certain. The sound of her heels faded down the hallway, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost holy. In that silence, Marianne closed the folder and said what no one else could. "That's not revenge. That's grace."